Daniel, is that what you want?
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when a marriage ends, and Catherine Hale would remember that silence for the rest of her life. She remembered the scratch of the pen, the way her husband signed his name without pausing, without looking up, without the smallest flicker of doubt. 29 years of marriage, reduced to a signature he completed in less than 3 seconds. Daniel Hale stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the lawyer's office into a waiting car. And beside that car stood a younger woman who smiled as though she had won something. Catherine sat alone at the table and folded the pen closed. What Daniel did not know, what no one in the city of Savannah knew that morning, was that he had just walked out on the wealthiest woman any of them had ever met. He believed he was trading up. He believed he was leaving behind a small woman with a small life, a bookshop that barely paid its own rent, a used car, a modest apartment, and a wife who had never once asked for more. He believed the younger woman on his arm represented everything he had been denied. And for a while, almost everyone who knew them believed the same thing. But the truth was waiting in a sealed envelope Catherine had kept in a drawer for nearly 30 years, an envelope she had never opened, from a father she had spent her whole life trying to forget. By the end of this story, you will learn what that letter contained, why a dying man chose silence over honesty, and which of the 3 people in this story was the only one who ever truly understood what they had. This is a true story about wealth, about betrayal, and about the strange, quiet way that life eventually returns to people exactly what they have given. To understand it, you have to meet 3 people. The first is Catherine, a woman of 54 who ran a bookshop on a narrow street near the river and knew every regular customer by name. The second is Daniel, her husband, a man who had spent 3 decades feeling that he deserved a larger life than the one he was living. And the third is Sloane Carver, a woman 15 years younger, polished and certain, who arrived in their lives like a door opening onto a brighter room. 3 people, 1 marriage, and a secret so large that when it finally surfaced, it would change the entire city's understanding of who Catherine Hale really was. Because there are questions buried in this story that do not have easy answers. Why would a man abandon a wife that everyone described as devoted, kind, and steady? What was the secret that Catherine carried for decades without ever knowing she carried it? And the question that all of Savannah would soon be whispering across dinner tables and country club terraces: how does the richest woman in the city not know that she is rich? These are the questions we are going to answer, slowly and carefully, the way the truth actually revealed itself. But before we go further, we have one small request for you. Before we do where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand Catherine, you have to go back much further than her marriage, all the way to a cold and enormous house on the edge of Savannah, where she grew up as the only child of a man named Edmund Vance. The Vance name once meant something in that city. Edmund had built his fortune quietly, through shipping, real estate, and investments that he discussed with no one, and he ran his household the same way he ran his business, with control, with distance, and with an expectation of obedience that left very little room for a child's heart. Catherine grew up in rooms that echoed, surrounded by things she was not allowed to touch, raised by a father who measured affection in performance and silence. She learned early that love in the Vance house was a transaction, and she promised herself that one day she would find something real. There is one memory from those years that Catherine carried with her always. She was 9 years old, and she had won a small prize at school, a ribbon for an essay she had written about the ocean. She ran the whole way home, breathless and proud, and she found her father in his study behind a wall of papers. She held the ribbon out to him with both hands. He looked at it for a moment, then looked back at his work, and he told her that ribbons were for people who needed reminding that they had done something, and that events should never need reminding. Then he asked her to close the door on her way out. She kept that ribbon in a box for the rest of her life, not because it reminded her of the prize, but because it reminded her of the exact moment she decided she would never live the way her father lived. That decision is what led her, at the age of 22, to do the one thing her father could never forgive. She fell in love with a young man named Daniel Hale, a charming, ambitious clerk with no money and no pedigree, and when Edmund forbade the match, Catherine made her choice. She walked away from the Vance fortune entirely. She left the cold house, refused the allowance, declined the inheritance, and married Daniel in a small ceremony that her father did not attend. She wanted a life built on love rather than money, and for many years, she believed that was exactly what she had. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that her father was watching her from a distance, and that behind his cold silence, a plan was already taking shape, or so it would later seem to everyone who pieced the story together. For the first decade, the life Catherine built with Daniel was modest but genuinely happy. They rented a small apartment above a hardware store, drove a second-hand car that needed constant attention, and saved every spare dollar toward the dream Catherine cherished most, a little bookshop of her own. When their daughter Claire was born, Catherine felt that her decision had been vindicated. She had traded a fortune for a family, and she did not regret it for a single day. Daniel, in those early years, seemed to love her completely. He worked hard, he climbed slowly through a series of firms, and he told her often that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. But somewhere in those years, quietly and without announcement, a different feeling began to take root in Daniel, a feeling that he had settled, that he had married into smallness when he was meant for something grand. There were good years in between, and it would be unfair to the truth to skip past them. Catherine remembered a summer when Claire was small, when the three of them packed the failing car and drove up the coast with no real plan, sleeping in cheap roadside motels and eating sandwiches on the hood of the car while the sun went down over the water. Daniel had laughed that whole trip easily and freely, the way he used to laugh before the comparisons set in. He had held Catherine's hand on the long stretches of empty highway and told her that he did not need anything more than this. She believed him completely, and for a long time those words were the foundation she stood on. Years later, after everything had come apart, she would wonder whether he had meant them, or whether he had simply not yet learned to want what he could not have. It is difficult to say exactly when Daniel's resentment took hold, because resentment rarely announces itself. It accumulates. It gathers in the spaces between what a man has and what he believes he deserves. Daniel watched his colleagues buy larger houses, join better clubs, and marry into established families, and each comparison left a small mark. He never blamed himself for the gap between his ambitions and his circumstances. Instead, slowly, he began to blame Catherine. He told himself that her bookshop was a hobby that drained their savings, that her contentment was a kind of laziness, that her refusal to want more was holding him back from the man he could have been. He never said these things aloud, not for years, but Catherine felt the temperature of the marriage change. The warmth that had defined their early life cooled into something distant, polite, and increasingly hollow. There was one evening in particular that Daniel never forgot, though he never told anyone about it. He had attended a dinner with the senior partners of his firm, and at the end of the night, one of them clapped him on the shoulder and asked, kindly enough, when Daniel was going to stop driving that old car and start living like a man who had arrived. It was meant as a joke. Everyone laughed, including Daniel, who laughed loudest of all. But he drove home in the dark in that same old car, and somewhere along the way the laughter curdled into something else. By the time he pulled into the lot beneath their apartment, he had decided, without quite admitting it to himself, that Catherine was the reason he had not arrived. It was not true. But resentment does not require truth. It only requires somewhere to point. And yet, even as her marriage grew colder, Catherine flourished in the one corner of her life that was entirely her own. After years of saving, she finally opened her bookshop on a narrow, cobbled street near the river, and it became the heart of the neighborhood. She knew which novels would comfort a grieving widow and which would delight a restless teenager. She kept a pot of coffee warm for the regulars and remembered the names of their children and their dogs. Her oldest friend, a sharp and loyal woman named Maggie Doyle, worked beside her 3 days a week, and the two of them ran the shop with the easy rhythm of people who had known each other for 30 years. To everyone who walked through that door, Catherine Hale seemed like a woman who had everything she needed and wanted nothing more, and in a way that no one yet understood, they were closer to the truth than they realized. Sloane Carver entered the story through Daniel's firm. She was a consultant, 15 years younger than Catherine, with an air of effortless success and a talent for making powerful men feel that they were finally being seen. She moved easily through the world Daniel longed to belong to, and when she turned her attention to him, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt chosen. He felt important. He felt like the version of himself he had always believed he was meant to be. At first it was only late dinners and long meetings, only conversations that ran past midnight, only the small lies that a man tells himself before he tells them to anyone else. But the foundation of the marriage had been weakening for a long time, and Sloane did not need to push very hard against a door that was already coming loose. The affair did not arrive all at once. It crept in through ordinary doors, the way these things usually do. A work dinner that ran long. A weekend conference in another city. A pattern of evenings where Daniel came home later and later, smelling faintly of a perfume Catherine did not own, offering explanations that were always plausible and never quite complete. Catherine noticed, the way wives almost always notice, but she told herself stories to soften what she saw, because the alternative was unbearable. She told herself he was under pressure at work. She told herself the distance was temporary. She told herself that a marriage of nearly 30 years could survive a cold season. And all the while, Daniel was building a second life in the shadows of the first, convincing himself that he deserved it, that he had earned it, that the woman waiting at home had stopped being enough a long time ago. There was something else happening during those months, something Catherine barely noticed and would not understand until much later. A well-dressed older man began appearing at the edges of her life. He attended a reading at her bookshop and bought a stack of poetry he never opened. He sat across the street in a parked sedan on more than one afternoon. His name was Arthur Whitfield, and he was one of the most discreet estate attorneys in the South. Maggie noticed him first, and she mentioned it to Catherine with a frown, asking why a man like that would keep turning up around a little shop near the river. Catherine laughed it off. She had no reason to think a stranger's presence meant anything at all. But Arthur Whitfield was not there by accident. He had been waiting for a very long time, and the moment he had been waiting for was finally drawing near. The affair between Daniel and Sloane lasted nearly a year before it surfaced, and when it did, it was not Catherine who discovered it, but their daughter Claire. By then Claire was a grown woman with a life of her own, and she had always adored her father. So when she saw him one evening at a restaurant across the city, leaning toward a woman who was not her mother, laughing in a way she had not seen him laugh in years, something inside her went cold. She did not confront him that night. She sat in her car for nearly an hour afterward, torn between the loyalty she felt toward the man who had raised her and the devotion she felt toward the woman who had given up everything for their family. In the end, Claire did what love demands. She told her mother the truth. It was the hardest thing Claire had ever done. She sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, the same table where she had done her homework as a child, and she watched her mother's face as she said the words out loud. She would describe that moment for years afterward as the instant she stopped being anyone's child and became, fully and finally, an adult, because she understood that some truths cannot be carried alone, and that protecting her mother meant wounding her. Catherine did not crumble. She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, and she thanked her, and she told her that she had done the right and brave thing. And then, in the quietest voice Claire had ever heard her use, Catherine asked to be left alone for a little while. Claire kissed her on the top of the head and went home and wept in her car for the second time. Catherine did not rage. She did not throw things or scream or collapse, though any of those reactions would have been understandable. Instead, she grew very quiet, the way she had learned to grow quiet as a child in her father's cold house. She listened to her daughter, she thanked her for her honesty, and then she sat alone in the bookshop after closing, long into the night, surrounded by the stories of other people's lives. She thought about the 29 years she had given to her marriage, the fortune she had walked away from, the dreams she had folded up and put aside. And somewhere in that long silence, she made a decision. She would not beg. She would not compete with a younger woman for a man who had already chosen to leave. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her dignity intact, because dignity was the one inheritance no one had ever been able to take from her. Daniel, for his part, moved quickly. Once the affair was in the open, he seemed almost relieved, as though a decision he had been postponing for years had finally been made for him. He filed for divorce within weeks, and he wanted it handled cleanly and quietly, before anything could complicate it. He was, by his own calculation, the wealthier partner in the marriage, and so he was almost generous in his terms. He waived any claim to the bookshop. He let Catherine keep their modest savings and the second-hand car. He told his lawyer that he had no interest in fighting over scraps, and he said it with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he was walking toward a larger and brighter future. He had no idea, none whatsoever, that he was about to make the most expensive miscalculation of his entire life. And so we arrive back at the moment where this story began, in the lawyer's office, with the scratch of a pen and a signature completed in less than 3 seconds. Daniel signed, stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out to the car where Sloane was waiting. Catherine signed more slowly, folded the pen closed, and gathered herself to face a future she could not yet imagine. But as she stepped out into the parking lot, a man approached her, the same well-dressed older man who had been appearing at the edges of her life for weeks. Arthur Whitfield introduced himself properly for the first time, and he spoke 6 words that Catherine did not understand but would never forget. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "we need to talk." And with those words, the true story, the one that had been waiting in silence for nearly 30 years, finally began to surface. In the weeks that followed the divorce, Catherine did what strong people do when their world has been rearranged without their permission. She put one foot in front of the other. She opened the bookshop every morning, brewed the coffee, greeted the regulars, and let the familiar rhythm of work carry her through the hardest days. Maggie stayed close, watching her friend with quiet concern, and Claire visited often, caught painfully between her love for her mother and the wreckage of her relationship with her father. To the outside world, Catherine appeared to be a woman gracefully accepting a difficult new chapter. But beneath that calm surface, questions had begun to gather, questions raised by a single conversation in a parking lot, questions about a father she thought she had left behind, and about a name, Vance, that seemed to be surfacing again after decades of silence. There was one afternoon in those weeks that Catherine would later describe as the moment she began to understand that she was going to be all right. An elderly customer, a man who had been coming to the shop for years, shuffled in out of the rain and told her, in a halting voice, that his wife had passed the month before, and that the only place he still felt like himself was among Catherine's shelves. He did not know about her divorce. He did not know anything about her at all, really, beyond the kindness she showed him every week. And Catherine realized, standing there in the warm light of her own shop, that she had built something real after all, something that mattered to people, something her father had never managed to build in all his years of wealth. Whatever Daniel had taken from her, he had not been able to touch that. Daniel, meanwhile, was discovering that the brighter future he had imagined came with a price he had not fully calculated. Sloane moved easily through a world of galas, designer labels, and expensive weekends, and she expected the man beside her to keep pace. The lifestyle that had seemed so effortless from the outside turned out to be enormously costly to maintain, and Daniel's salary, respectable as it was, began to strain under the weight of it. He told himself it was an investment in a new life, that things would settle, that he had made the right choice. But late at night, in a sleek apartment that did not yet feel like home, a thin thread of doubt began to work its way through his certainty, or so it seemed to those who knew him then, the first faint sign that he had gambled on the wrong future. It was Maggie who first started pulling at the loose threads. She had never forgotten the well-dressed stranger, and after the divorce, when Catherine mentioned that the same man had approached her in the parking lot, Maggie's instincts went on alert. She began asking quiet questions around the city, and what she learned only deepened the mystery. The Vance estate, she discovered, had never been publicly settled after Edmund's death years earlier. The fortune had simply disappeared from public view, locked away behind layers of legal structure that no one outside a small circle of attorneys could penetrate. Claire, drawn into her mother's puzzle, began searching through old family papers, and she found references to trusts, to foundations, to documents bearing the Vance name that Catherine had never been shown. Something had been arranged long ago, deliberately and carefully, and Catherine had been kept at the very center of it without ever knowing. Claire found one document in particular that she could not stop thinking about. It was a single page, half of a photocopy, tucked inside an old folder of her grandfather's correspondence that her mother had kept out of obligation rather than affection. The page referred to a beneficiary by initials only, CVH, and it described conditions that would trigger the release of an estate whose value was not stated anywhere on the page. CVH Catherine Vance Hale. Claire sat on her bedroom floor with that page in her hands for a long time, her heart pounding, understanding that she was holding the corner of something enormous and not yet able to see its shape. She did not tell her mother right away. She wanted to be certain. And in the days she spent searching for certainty, the rest of the city began, independently, to ask the very same questions. For a time, the truth seemed to point in several wrong directions at once. There was a stretch of weeks when it appeared that Daniel might be the one hiding money, that perhaps he had concealed assets during the divorce, and Claire spent days chasing that suspicion before it collapsed into nothing. Then attention turned toward Sloane, whose finances seemed far less stable than her glamorous lifestyle suggested, and for a while it looked as though she might be running some scheme of her own at Daniel's expense. Each false lead pulled the family deeper into confusion, and each one, in its own way, distracted them from the real answer, which was hiding in plain sight, inside a sealed envelope in a bookshop drawer. The truth, when it finally arrived, would not be about Daniel's secrets or Sloane's ambitions. It would be about Catherine herself. The whispers began in the places where old money gathers, in the dining rooms and on the terraces where the families of Savannah measured one another by names and histories. A society columnist, idly researching an unrelated story, came across the Vance name and was surprised to find that the old fortune had never been dispersed. She made a few calls. She asked a few questions. And slowly, a remarkable possibility began to take shape, the possibility that the entire Vance estate, untouched and quietly compounding for decades, still belonged to a single living heir. People who had known Edmund began to remember the daughter who had vanished from society 30 years earlier, the girl who had married beneath her and disappeared into an ordinary life. They began to wonder where she was now. And almost no one, at first, connected that lost Vance heiress to the kind woman who ran the little bookshop near the river. When Arthur Whitfield finally sat down with Catherine to explain what he had been guarding for so long, she did not believe him at first. He told her that her father had not disinherited her when she walked away. He told her that Edmund Vance had, in fact, done the opposite. Quietly, methodically, and without ever telling a soul, Edmund had placed the entire Vance fortune into a trust naming Catherine as the sole heir. The estate had been managed and grown for decades by a small team of attorneys bound by absolute confidentiality, and its value now was almost beyond comprehension. Arthur explained that the trust had been structured to settle only under certain conditions, conditions that had finally been met. Catherine sat in stunned silence as the truth settled over her. The woman with the used car and the struggling bookshop was, and had been for years, the wealthiest woman in the entire city. The numbers, when Arthur laid them out, were difficult for Catherine to hold in her mind. The Vance fortune was not merely large. It dwarfed the wealth of every prominent family in Savannah combined. There were properties she had never seen, holdings in companies whose names she recognized from the news, accounts that had been growing untouched for 30 years. And as the estate moved toward its final settlement, the news could no longer be contained. It moved through the city the way such news always does, first as a rumor, then as a certainty, then the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. The kind woman from the bookshop, the one who remembered everyone's children and kept the coffee warm, was the richest person any of them had ever known. And somewhere across the city, in a sleek and expensive apartment, Daniel Hale heard the news, and the ground shifted beneath him. It is hard to imagine the weight of what Daniel felt in that moment, though we can try. For 30 years he had believed that he had married into smallness, that Catherine's contentment was a cage, that her refusal to want more had held him back from the life he deserved. He had walked away from her with the confidence of a man trading up, certain that he was leaving the poorer life behind. And now he learned that the woman he had discarded, the woman whose bookshop he had dismissed and whose dreams he had quietly resented, had been carrying a fortune so vast that it rearranged the entire social order of the city. Everything he had chased for 3 decades, the status, the recognition, the larger life, had been sitting across from him at the breakfast table every single morning, and he had walked right past it on his way out the door. Sloane Carver, too, recalculated everything in an instant. The man she had chosen had seemed, in the world she moved through, like a solid investment, a rising figure with a respectable income and an open future. But the revelation of Catherine's fortune cast a harsh new light on her choice. Daniel was not, and would never be, the kind of wealthy that the Vance name represented. He was a man with a strained salary and an expensive new life he could barely sustain, a man who had given up the only door that might have led to the world Sloane truly wanted. The warmth she had shown him began to cool, the way warmth always cools when the calculation behind it changes. And Daniel, watching it happen, began to understand the true shape of what he had traded, and the true nature of what he had chosen. Catherine, for her part, did not celebrate. The fortune did not make her feel triumphant, and it did not tempt her toward revenge. If anything, it overwhelmed her with a question she could not answer, the question of why. Why had her father kept this secret for so long? Why had he let her struggle through 3 decades of modest living, driving a failing car and counting every dollar, when he could have given her ease at any moment? Why the silence, the distance, the cold and deliberate concealment? She thought about resenting the memory of him, about hating him for the years of unnecessary hardship. But before she allowed herself to feel anything at all, she remembered the one thing she had never opened, the sealed envelope she had carried from house to house for nearly 30 years, the letter from her father that she had refused to read out of old and stubborn pain. That night, alone in the quiet of her bookshop, Catherine finally took the envelope from the drawer and broke the seal. The handwriting inside was her father's, careful and deliberate, written in the final months of his life. And as she read, the entire story rearranged itself around her, every assumption she had carried, every grievance she had nursed, every year she thought she understood. Her father had not kept the fortune secret to punish her. He had kept it secret to protect her. He wrote that he had watched money destroy every relationship in his own life, that he had never once been certain whether a single person who claimed to love him had loved him for himself or for what he could provide. And he had refused, with everything in him, to let that same doubt poison his daughter's life. He had structured the secret deliberately, he explained, so that Catherine would be loved, or not loved, entirely for who she was. He wanted her to marry without a fortune hanging over the decision, to build a life in which no one could ever want her for her money, because no one would know it existed. And he wanted something else, something he confessed he had no right to ask for after the cold way he had raised her. He wanted her to discover her own worth, fully and completely, in a life she had built with her own hands, before fortune ever entered the picture. The trust he had arranged would reveal itself only when Catherine stood truly on her own, when whatever was going to happen in her marriage had already happened, so that the money could never be the reason anyone stayed, and never be the reason anyone left. In the final lines of the letter, Edmund Vance wrote something that Catherine read over and over until she had memorized it. He wrote that he had been a poor father, that he had confused control with care and silence with strength, and that he had only understood his mistakes when it was too late to correct them. He wrote that the fortune was the smallest part of what he wished he could leave her, and that the larger part, the part he had ruined, was the chance to have simply loved her well. He asked her to forgive him if she could, and to forgive herself for the years of doubt, and to remember that she had always been worth a great deal more than anything written in any account. Catherine sat with the letter against her chest until the sun came up, weeping for a father she had spent her life trying to forget, and finally, in the strangest way, beginning to understand him. As Catherine read those words, the full weight of the irony settled over her. Without ever knowing it, Daniel had spent 29 years inside a test he could not see. Every day he had been given the chance to love a woman simply for who she was, a kind, steady, devoted woman with a warm heart and a quiet life. And every day, slowly, he had chosen resentment instead. He had measured her against the larger life he imagined, and he had found her wanting, never once suspecting that the larger life had been beside him all along, hidden inside the very woman he was learning to despise. Edmund Vance had built his secret to reveal the truth of a person's heart, and in the end, it had revealed Daniel's with devastating clarity. He had failed a test he never knew he was taking, and the cost of that failure was almost beyond measure. What Catherine chose to do with the fortune became, in time, the most telling part of the entire story. She did not use it to humiliate Daniel, though she easily could have. She did not buy the firm that employed him, or close the doors that he depended on, or parade her new wealth through the social world that had once forgotten her. Revenge, she decided, would only chain her to the very smallness she had spent her life refusing. Instead, she did something quieter and far more powerful. She established the Vance Foundation, and she turned its resources toward the city she actually loved, restoring the old street where her bookshop stood, funding libraries and scholarships, and lifting up the ordinary neighborhoods that the old money of Savannah had always overlooked. She kept her bookshop. She kept her second-hand habits. And she chose her small, real life all over again, this time entirely on her own terms. The foundation's first scholarship went to a girl from the neighborhood around the bookshop, a quiet, brilliant teenager who had been coming in after school for years to read books she could not afford to buy. Catherine handed her the letter announcing the award personally, in the same shop where the girl had spent so many afternoons, and she told her only that someone had once believed she was worth investing in, and that she was simply passing the gift along. The girl would go on to become a teacher in that very city, and years later she would tell that story to her own students, never knowing that the woman who had changed her life was the richest person in Savannah. That was exactly how Catherine wanted it. The money, she had decided, would be loudest when it spoke through other people's lives, and silent everywhere else. As for Daniel, his story ended not in dramatic ruin but in something quieter and perhaps more fitting. Sloane drifted away within the year, her interest fading as the truth of his finances became clear, and Daniel found himself alone in an expensive apartment that had never truly felt like home, carrying the knowledge of exactly what he had thrown away. He did not lose everything. He kept his job and his respectable salary and the life he had been so eager to escape into. But he carried, for the rest of his days, the unbearable awareness that the greatest fortune he would ever encounter had loved him once, completely and for nothing, and that he had signed it away in less than 3 seconds without ever looking up. There is no punishment a court could impose that would weigh heavier than that. There is a quiet footnote to this story that deserves to be told, because it concerns the two people who never wavered. Maggie Doyle kept working 3 days a week at the bookshop, exactly as she always had, and she refused, gently but firmly, every attempt Catherine made to give her more than a fair wage. She said she had not stayed for 30 years for the money, and she was not about to start now. And Claire, who had carried the terrible burden of telling her mother the truth, grew closer to Catherine than she had ever been, the two of them bound now by everything they had survived together. When people asked Catherine, in the years that followed, what the fortune had given her, she would smile and say that the fortune had given her almost nothing she did not already have. The people who loved her had loved her before they knew, and that, she said, was the only inheritance that had ever mattered. And so we are left with the question that sits at the very heart of this story, the question that Catherine herself wrestled with in the quiet of her bookshop long after the fortune had changed her life. What is a person actually worth, and how do we measure it? Daniel spent 3 decades chasing the appearance of wealth, the larger house, the better club, the brighter future, and in his hunger for the appearance of it, he walked past the real thing every single morning at his own breakfast table. Edmund Vance, cold and distant as he was, understood something his son-in-law never did, that the truest test of love is whether it survives in the absence of reward. Catherine had passed that test without ever knowing it existed, simply by being who she was. And in the end, her greatest inheritance was not the fortune at all. It was the knowledge that she had been worthy of love all along. Before we close this story, we want to hear from you, because a story like this one always leaves something behind. Catherine's father hid an entire fortune to discover who would love his daughter for herself, and not for her money. Was that the cruelest thing he ever did to her, robbing her of years of ease and certainty, or was it, in its strange and painful way, the kindest, a gift of clarity that no amount of money could ever buy? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And be honest with yourself for a moment. If you had been in Catherine's life, would you have seen what Daniel missed? Would you have recognized the quiet, extraordinary worth of a woman who asked for nothing and gave everything? These are the questions that stay with us long after the story ends. If this story moved you, then there is something you need to understand. Stories like Catherine's are not as rare as we would like to believe. All around us, in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, people carry secrets and worth that the world has failed to see, and sometimes the truth surfaces only when everything else has fallen away. In our next story, you will meet a man everyone in his town had written off as a failure, a quiet, forgotten figure who was hiding a truth that would leave an entire community speechless. If the story of Catherine Hale stayed with you, that one will stay with you even longer. So before you go, take a moment to subscribe, because there is a whole shelf of these stories waiting, and we would hate for you to miss a single one. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.